Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Lisa Schwartz. I've got with me Greg Sanker. We are going to be getting officially started in 1 minute. Greg, I got to tell you though, in the registration form, we allow for comments and questions. And Simone said, I'm looking forward to the best change manager dancer to do the go-go for governance.
I think Simone is going to be sadly disappointed today.
Oh, I think we're all going to be happy. And then we'll do this again at the end. But Anna Maria is asking, what steps can I take to mature our knowledge base so that it is more user-friendly and less techno speak? We believe that our end users could become much more self-sufficient if they could access content which is geared toward non-IT audience. Like I said, don't answer it yet, but I'll ask that again at the end. But I just wanted to put that in your thought process, if you will.
Awesome. So is this how we make that person stay until the very end? We'll
It
answer the
is
question.
indeed. I think everyone smart enough to be here today is going to be smart enough to stay to the very end. Hey, look at that. We're at the top of the hour. So I'm going to just pause for 1 second to give, as you guys know, we record these sessions and then we post them up on the YouTube later. So just to give Nina a natural break. Here you go, Nina, for the recording break. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Lisa Schwartz with ITSM Academy. I am very excited about today's presentation with Greg Sanker. The copy of the slides are available via a link that we have put in the chat channel. If you are on social media and you want to follow along asking questions that way, feel free. Please use the hashtag AskITSM. And with really no further ado, Greg is a former CIO for government, has come back to private sector as a practitioner. He is a ITIL expert in every sense of the word and a managing professional. He really has a specialty around change management and governance. So Greg, I turn it over to you and thank you again.
Thank you. So are you seeing my screen, Lisa, before I get started?
Yes, sir.
So I love the title that we gave this, and I sincerely hope that you'll ask questions, because to me this is less of a presentation, a one-way presentation, and more of a dialogue. The more time I spend doing service management, the more I realize it's about us, it's about community, it's about us working together. So please put your questions in there. In fact, if you can do it early and often, that would be awesome. Lisa has just put up, or the powers that be behind the scenes has just put up a poll, and I would love to get you to take a look at that and answer, if you will. Your answers are: focus on risk and compliance, primarily an information security concern. My governance is slow and bureaucratic. What's governance got to do with ITSM? And any other answers that you might have. But if you do, please put that in the chat window and we can talk about that. So well,
Greg, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second just to ask, what do you think our number one response is going to be today?
Here's what I think. That this is based on, this is not just shot from the hip. My personal opinion is, it's being with lots of folks around the world who work in IT, it's going to be slow and bureaucratic. When you say governance, people cringe. People struggle with the concept or the application or what they've seen of governance. And that's partly why I want to talk about this topic. So
I would have guessed exactly the same, and I'm thrilled to tell you that we are both very, very wrong.
Awesome.
I'm gonna close down this poll in just 1 second. We still have people responding to it, and in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, she's closed. And let me go ahead and share those responses with you now.
This is awesome. Okay, now that doesn't entirely surprise me. Wow, that's a good breakdown. Focus on risk and compliance, slow and bureaucratic, not too distant. governance doesn't necessarily bring its way all the way down into to the practice levels. I'm not sure what the other was. I don't see that in the chat, but if you could let us know what you think other is, if it's fit for public consumption, I would love to
It
hear from you.
is. Well, one of the others was something, I love this, Greg, something everyone wants, but no one wants to do / create.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
reminds me of a sign that was hanging up in our kitchen as kids. It was my mom's. Housework is one of those things that no one appreciates until you don't do it. And I feel like governance is kind of the same as
It,
that.
it really truly is. So while we've been talking, I've quietly slipped in the little slide that says really cool things about me and why you should listen to me, because I'm so awkward with that, guys. I'm just here to help. I'm just me being me. So let's talk a little bit about the topic of governance. So ITSM success is contingent upon 3 bodies of work, in my opinion, or in my observation, and those are the practices, or as we used to call them in the good old days, and I lost out when ITIL 4 came out, are capabilities, or IT capabilities, or more probably accurate in the governance context is organizational capabilities. But those practices are pretty well covered elsewhere, and you all know that. Leadership is a growing area of interest in organizations, because the world is changing very, very rapidly. The workforce is evolving faster than leadership practices have evolved. Thankfully, there's a tremendous amount of good practice and good guidance in that space, and I speak of both of those quite a lot. But today we're going to talk about governance. It is the area that I think is most challenging for organizations, and I say that from the perspective of I've been doing service management either informally or formally for going on 30 years. And in case you didn't know, I was one of the authors of the change management practice guide for ITIL 4, and I was the chief examiner for some of the ITIL 4 material. So I'm deeply connected with what they've done in ITIL 4, what the core authors and the authoring teams have done with that. And there's a lot of elements that, unless you're taking a governance perspective, you might not really fully recognize what has happened. And so I want to talk about that today. So we start with, well, what is governance? And I'm going from a business perspective. Governance today defines it as all of those processes by which an organization is directed, controlled, and held to account. And it goes on to say that includes authority, accountability, leadership, direction, and control that's exercised within an organization. So governance is fairly comprehensive. And I think one of the challenges that we experience in organizations is when the senior leadership, as well as the rest of us in the organization, really don't truly understand the art and science of governance and apply it in some misconfigured sort of way. So let's talk about what governance is not. And you may recognize some of these. You may recognize some of what it's how it's been played out in your organization or organizations where you've been. So it is not about command and control. And let me just pause and say, yes, there has been a tremendous amount of command and control, particularly from the last century, where that was a very common management model, is decisions were made at the top and they were pushed down to the bottom. And let me say this, and I'm going to slow down so that you don't misquote me and get this really, really clear. Command and control is a form of governance, but by itself, it is not governance. It is one way to govern an organization. And if that's appropriate in an organization, like typically in a military organization, there's a fair amount of command and control. Government or heavily regulated industries, this tends to be more and more practice. But as we move into the information age and we recognize that we're in knowledge workers, we recognize that that is one way that may not best fit the current environment. And so I'm getting back to the root and say, do not connect governance with this form of governance, it's a form of governance, okay? So, and it's not exclusively about regulatory compliance. So every organization to some degree has internal and external compliance expectations. So a lot of organizations are subject to things like GDPR or other privacy and compliance, HIPAA, NIST 800, depending on where you're at. There's lots of regulatory and compliance frameworks, and if they apply to the organization, well, then of course governance needs to make sure that those are happening. But again, governance is not equal to regulatory compliance. That's one element of what a governed organization must ensure is happening. Let's talk about governance. It's not just about information security, and it's not specifically about risk management. Again, that's an element of it, but that is not one and the same with it. And it's not about slowing everything down and making things slow and bureaucratic. And it's not antithetical to generating business value. I know that there's a lot of thought out in this world, particularly in those that are practitioners at ground zero, where the work is actually being done, that believe that we could deliver more value more quickly and be more agile and responsive to our customers if it just weren't for this darn management that was gumming up the works with all this governance talk. And they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, I'm going to go on to tell you how we accelerate putting the go in our governance as we go on. Also, this is something that I think really needs to be hammered home, and that is governance doesn't mean making IT do things the way that they're supposed to do things. Every part of an organization is governed. If we go back to that definition, which I'm not going to go back a bunch of slides, there's nothing in there that spoke specifically to IT. It talked about how decisions and authority happened within an organization. And that we need to understand that HR and manufacturing and marketing and all of the other parts of an organization are also subject to governance. And how it works there, I don't know, I'm not an HR professional, but there is a governing factor there because that's how an organization ensures that it's achieving the goals and objectives of its stakeholders. So let's look at the things that government is involved with. And if you've studied governance, you might recognize these. So one of them is to evaluate the situation. And I'm going to try to unfold this gently so that we can all see it. The other is to provide direction, and the last is to monitor. Now you recognize that these are all interrelated. And we're going to get into that just a little bit more. But when you're truly functioning in the governance realm, part of the governance function is to monitor what's happening within the organization, to evaluate, is that appropriate? Is it meeting our needs? And I'm going to go into what those specific things are in a moment. And then if it is, it provides direction. If it's not, it provides corrective direction. And that's how a governed organization is aligned from top to bottom. So remember, when you're thinking about governance, we're talking about these things, and these are very, very high level objectives. And we're going to talk about why that is in just a minute. So we all recognize that in an organization, there's something mythical called governance. And I'm drawing it up here at the top of the slide because it typically happens at the top of an organization, and there's a reason for that. We also recognize that there is a management function within an organization. And between the two, that's where your evaluate, your direct, and your monitor is happening, is because there's an interface between these two activities. But here I want to slow down again and emphasize that there's a point of demarcation between organizational governance and organizational management. The twain shall not meet, which I think is proper English, because an organization cannot govern itself. A person, a function, a team, a division within an organization cannot govern itself. And the reason for that is because governance determines what are the requirements, what are the controls, what are the compliance factors, what are the decision-making authorities. Governance makes those decisions. And then governance also determines, are you meeting those expectations? So if I'm governing myself, then I can say, well, I think I'm going to hold myself accountable to this. And then later I can say, and I'm doing a really good job of that. Now, so you recognize the inherent conflict of interest or even the lack of objectivity. And so in organizations, and this is true throughout, whether you're in nonprofit, non-government organizations, government organizations, or Fortune 10 corporations, this is the building blocks of how the organization runs. Now, what we see in so many organizations, that's why I've drawn this slide, and if you've heard me present, you might have seen some form of this before, because where I see problems arise is when governance is dipping down in and performing like management, or when management is rising up and acting as if they're governing themselves. And that's where we get the significant amount of problems that we have. Governance is inherently high level, it's visionary, it's directional, and it's at the the boardroom level, the board of directors, depending on how the organization is structured. And it's management responsibility to actually achieve those things that governance has determined is appropriate. So ultimately, governance is accountable. The governing body is accountable for how the organization operates, how efficient and effective it is, how well it's complying with regulatory and internal requirements, and all of those elements. That's the role of governance, but it does so through management. And I'm going to pause right there for just a moment. I want to let that sink in, because I think there's going to be questions around this very, very topic. And I think some of the questions are going to be around, I understand what you're saying, but how does that work in real life? And so I'm going to try to paint that picture. And it is the pain point. It is the piece why we in service management have to understand the proper role of governance, so we can work with governance in a proper sort of way and not have a growing resentment against the concept of governance. So governance ensures that the organization's performance is appropriate for what they're doing, and is conformance. Those are the key elements that governance ensures. So performance includes things like financial performance, efficiency performance, performance against the stated goals and objectives as opposed to other goals and objectives. There's a lot of pieces involved with performance within an organization. And of course, conformance has to do with adhering to internal and external regulations or expectations. It can also include statement of intent within the organization. In other words, there may be no requirement that drives a certain set of behaviors or preferences within the organization, but it may be part of the organization's culture, or part of its founding statement, or part of its belief system or worldview that it's expressing through the organization. That's particularly true in nonprofits or non-government organizations that are non-for-profit. These are things that the governance needs to make sure that we're adhering to why it is that we exist in the first place. But it's also true in a private sector or for-profit organization, as conformance becomes really important. And it is not simply checking the NIST 853 boxes or others. There's much, much more than that. Okay. So as we look at governance, I've painted it as a set of puzzle pieces that come together. Here's some of the conversations or some of the connections between the two. And I just want to bring this out just a little bit further. Is there is an interface between governance as a concept and leadership as a concept, because governance relies on appropriate leadership. So leadership needs both direction, and they need to provide feedback into the governing body about, this is how we're operating, this is how we behave, this is what our ethical stance is, this is what our employee performance standards are, this is how we make decisions around projects and priorities and investment opportunities. There's a lot of leadership elements associated with governance that is not one and the same with governance. Let's be clear on that. And of course, the other piece is practices. Now, here I want to zoom out. Is you in organizations, you have a capability to manufacture products, or to maintain a public presence for digital services, or there's lots of practices or capabilities within an organization, and they're informed both by leadership and by governance. And that's how the accountability is set up. And I think of this as the magic triangle. And what we find so often, as I've pointed out, is you're going to find weaknesses in one of these three areas. This is kind of like the legs of a three-legged stool. And as you can imagine, if you have a very strong set of practices and you have strong leadership, but you have weak governance, you're going to have a chair that's very tipped. In fact, if it's really out of balance, it may not even be stable on its own. Likewise, if you have solid practices, but poor leadership and weak governance, you're going to also be tipping in that direction. So we need all of these three. And as practitioners, and I'm as guilty as anybody else is, it has been my belief that by having solid, repeatable, mature processes, we're delivering on our value proposition to the organization. And it's not entirely true, because those processes are part of a broader capability to deliver value within the organization. And we're going to talk about that. And if you've studied ITIL 4, and I hope most of you have, this is language that starts getting into that space, and you start understanding why they've gone in the direction that they have gone. So there's good practice here, there's good practice here. That leaves us talking about this. So I'm going to talk about the differences between processes, because at one point I identified myself as a recovering process engineer, because I've spent a lot of time in my early career, which is a long time ago, building and optimizing processes and putting the right controls, the right metrics in place. But the thing about processes is, as everybody knows, we used to talk about this in service management. We talk about a process takes inputs, has a trigger, follows activities, and produces outputs. In other words, a process is designed to take specific input and provide specific output. And it does that by following a set of steps and activities that are used to convert inputs to outputs. And one of the ways that we focus on processes, and this is still true, I'm not denigrating this as a practice, but by having processes that are consistent, and we measure that by what we'd call process maturity, CMMI, or other ways of measuring processes. But what we're doing is we're looking specifically at that process in terms of its ability to consistently, reliably, predictably, and auditably change inputs into outputs. And so what we're really focused on when you look at process is, are we producing the output? And that has its share of challenges. Now, a lot of folks in the service management world, myself included, have talked about IT capabilities for a very long time, because we recognize that processes are just one piece of a capability. So let's talk now about practices. And Lisa, if you wanted to go ahead and put up that second poll, I think now would probably be about as good a time as any.
I like it.
I'm going to continue to talk about practices, because you guys can multitask, right? There it is. Who's responsible for governance in an organization? You can either answer specifically for your organization or what you believe the correct answer to be. So while that is showing, I'm going to continue on here. So over here in practices, and you guys have studied this is not rocket science, but I'm trying to put it in the context of governance, is a practice or a capability takes a demand or an opportunity or a business turn and turns that into value. That's the focus of a practice. And it has to be dynamic and adaptive, because the focus isn't on necessarily how we do the nuts and bolts, but do we understand how we produce value, and are we doing it consistently? So we've elevated the altitude, which hopefully I'll have a moment to talk about that and a little bit down the road. And it includes processes. And that's the thing. It's like, it's not processes or practices. It's practices encompass processes, usually many processes, each of which needs to be consistently matured and followed and executed. So there's nothing wrong with that. But as a practice, we're now focusing in on value production, are delivering value to our stakeholders, to our partners, and to others. We call it co-creation in ITIL 4. In the past, it's just simply been, we're part of producing business value, not just IT value, and certainly not just delivering IT widgets that somebody else, good luck, some assembly required with the things that we put out. So the focus now becomes much more about being in the value streams. And there's a recognition that when we talk about value streams, there is a whole lot more going on. And I think most of us, raise your hand to a blank camera if you recognize yourself as, we've all recognized that processes are a little bit theoretical, because in real life, nothing happens like it is in the book. It's like there's no way that we're just going to adopt, the process that's on page 42 of the ITIL 3 book. That's not what's going to happen. So as practitioners, we've always adapted, and we've adopted it to make the good practice work within our organization. But recognizing that we're operating in value streams, and so there's a series of steps or functions within those value streams that are assembled uniquely and produce value. And what we've done is we've really elevated, and that's going to become important here in just a minute, because we're focused on producing outcomes. And I could add business outcomes, because those are the things that we need to measure ourselves by. And so we're not looking at a microscope to, is our process optimized, and is it being followed, and is everybody doing it right? But we're now stepping back and looking at, how does this process contribute to a practice that is producing value to my organization? And now all of a sudden, you've got the attention of your senior staff. Before we go play to win, Lisa, do we have results yet?
Yes, Alex, we do.
We do. Oh, I like this. So I used a specific word, and I recognize that it was a bit of a trick question, because if you're familiar with the RACI chart, accountable is a specific function. And so we said that everybody in IT is accountable. And as you know, if everybody's accountable, then nobody's accountable. And that happens a lot. I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. I'm suggesting that that's right, and it's problematic. And then next we go from ground zero, everyone who's doing actual work that produces value in the organization, all the way up to the ether around the boardroom, where the board of directors is responsible for. That's the top popular answers, and that represents a kind of a bifurcation of the challenge. And I see this in organizations. It's either we're focusing too low, and that's problematic, or we're focusing too high, and that's problematic. Now, interestingly, and I didn't expect this, is I thought this was a little bit of a detractor, but I'm surprised that the CIO or the IT director, depending on your structure, actually scored so prominently. And I think that we put CIOs in this spot a lot. And I'm gonna comment on that here before we get to the very end, because a CIO sits right at that point of demarcation in most organizations. They might actually sit a level below if you report to the CFO, which is actually fairly common. But the idea is that a CIO or an IT director is actually at the management layer. They're not at the governing layer. They may sit at the governing table. They may provide input or advice or consult or make recommendations, but they themselves are not, generally speaking, by description or function, they are not part of the governing body. But when we make them the governing body, we put them in a very untenable position. Because then the CIO gets subject, and don't ask me how I know, the CIO gets subject to questions like, well, why did you do that? It's like, now we're going to apply accountability for a decision that really shouldn't have been delegated to you in the first place, but we're going to hold you accountable because we're not clear where that point of demarcation is. So as we all know, the CIO turns around and says to her staff, like, hey, how come you guys screwed up here? Or how come these things happen? And the pathology goes on and on and on in organizations. But I do want to talk a little bit about that everybody is accountable for it. And that is an interesting view, which is very, very common. So nobody on here is wrong, and you're reflecting the reality that you've been operating in. But think about that for a minute, is that puts each of us in the spot of getting to decide if we're actually being responsible for or accountable for governance. We get to decide what applies to us, and then we get to decide for ourselves whether we're actually complying with that. And where we start slowing down, or we will wind up into trouble, is if those disconnects are significant enough, that's going to catch the attention of somebody at a much higher level who theoretically should be accountable for that, and says, no, that's not right. So that decision that you've made, that direction that you've chosen, the projects that you've prioritized are not in alignment with what this organization does. You're doing the wrong thing. And when that happens, we all know what happens. We come to a grinding halt. We get frustrated. We throw up our arms. It's like, well, now you sprouted an opinion, or you didn't tell us before what you wanted, but now you're telling us what you don't want. And all of these frustrations, these points of tension, these points of friction are what slow us down. So if you want to go, and you want to go fast in an organization, we have to get the governance down right. So let's talk about playing to win, which is where I go with this slide. And so from here on out, we're going to look at the various elements, and then we're going to round the corner and talk about some really, really practical things, because if I were to give myself a byline about what I like to do, I'm the practical, been there, done that guy, because I've been in organizations that have made just about every mistake in the book, and I've made a few of myself on my own to extend the practice just a little bit. So let's talk about playing to win. So the first thing that playing to win has to do with performance and conformance. Now, I'm a race fan, and that's awesome, but you don't have to be a race fan to understand that when you're in a race, winning is what we do. We want to place first. We want to outperform other race teams. We want to outperform other drivers on the course. We want our car to perform better and to go more quickly. We want to have a good season, so not just a single race, but a series of races, and we win the cup at the end, or whatever it is. And so if you bring that analogy to organizations, it is all about performance. But let me ask you this. If you've ever been in a car where the brakes failed, and I have many, many years ago, the question then becomes, how fast do you feel comfortable going? And the answer is not very fast. Now, you can go slow, and back in the old days, you could use gears to kind of control your speed. But if a child comes out in front of your car, you are not going to be able to stop. And so there's this feeling that we might be out of control here at any speed. So if you want to go fast, we have to have certain controls in place. Now, talk about conformance. You think about race teams, it's like, it's not about conformance, it's not about regulatory. Yes, it is. You don't show up at the track unless you meet the rigid requirements for engine size and the parameters and the size of the wings and the horsepower and the safety features and all of these other things that are part of conforming. You have to conform in order to compete, and you have to be competing and playing to win. So if you go overboard on a car that strictly just meets the requirements but isn't functional, then you have a losing season. If you focus on performance but you get kicked out of the race because you don't conform, then you also get booted out of competition. So there's a lot of analogies here, and one of the ways that we do that is through what we call business controls. And I'm not talking about IT controls, I'm talking about business controls. And business controls happen in a number of fashions. So if I can't turn left or right, that's a problem. If I can't change gears on my automobile, that's a problem. Likewise, if there's an inability in an organization to select projects and ongoing oversight of projects, are we working on the right ones? Do we need to make a change of direction here? Are these in alignment with a vision and direction that's coming from the top? If we don't have those controls in place, and those controls could be meetings, they could be requirements, hard requirements, soft requirements, other expectations for transparency and reporting. There's lots of controls that we put in place, but we do it so we can move quickly with speed. And that's going to land wrong with some of you, because you've seen lots and lots of controls that do nothing but put delays and meetings and endless oversights and questions and people who have no idea about the technical parameters of the thing being discussed asking questions about it. It is problematic, but that doesn't mean we don't need it. It means that we need to get good at it. Let's talk about decision making, because decision making in an organization is incredibly important. Who gets to decide? Who has the authority to make what decisions? I gave the example earlier. If somebody that's working in an IT practice makes a decision, this is going to be an optimal decision, and somebody else says you don't have the authority to do that, or you can't do that because that adversely impacts them, all of a sudden now you're slowed down in bureaucracy, not because we have decision making clarified, but because we don't have decision making clarified. That becomes problematic for a lot of organizations. Goals alignment is really important. Is what's happening at the top is actually the vision and strategy and direction of the organization overall. The responsibility of every layer from there to ground zero is to make sure that all of our goals at every level are in alignment with the vision and direction, and increasingly agility in getting there, by the way. And also what we call value realization is, at the end of the day, are we achieving what we set out to achieve? Are we producing the value that this organization was started for, or it currently exists for? So let's take a look at each one of those, right? So let's talk about performance and conformance. So conformance has to do with internal and external compliance. You need to be clear on what those are. It has to do with risk management. In other words, the organization at the top has what we would call an appetite for risk. In other words, their business strategy, the corporate culture, the DNA, the very fabric of the organization has a risk appetite that it needs to express in a structure that allows the right decision making with regard to risk management, risk mitigation, so that the organization is operating at a risk level that's appropriate to the organization. I was consulting with an organization once upon a time, naturally on change management, where I'm fairly well known for, and a major outage, significant outage that caused that organization to not be able to do point of sale cards for a very uncomfortable length of time, an entire day, business day. And so the question that I asked was, and when we recognized that there was a specific change that caused that, I said, did the business manager who was accountable for daily revenue, was that person aware that their ability to process payments was at risk with this change? Because if not, then the right level to take on that risk on behalf of the business was not consulted, and it was made at a much too low of level. And that's part of how we manage risk within an organization. And we also need to talk about maximizing performance. And that's where we get into efficiency and effectiveness, which have been bywords of service management for a very, very long time. But this isn't necessarily has to do with, if Johnny doesn't close enough tickets, we're going to throw him out the window. And it may not have to do with faster. It might have to do with cultural elements that have to do with performance of teams. It's widely recognized that some level of self-organization and autonomy and decision-making at ground zero will maximize the performance in most or many cases. And the responsibility of leadership is to put the right pieces in place. So maximization of performance is not necessarily, cranking down your process, but it may be focusing on cultural elements or leadership elements or some of the DNA level things that may be impacting performance, which is why it's a governance issue and not a practices issue. And also, we measure that simply based on how well we're contributing to achieving of business outcomes. That's what we need to do. Now, and realize all of these things that I'm talking about are, as practitioners, as people that are working in the practices or developing the capabilities, is you need to be doing your work in such a way that you recognize that these are important elements. And if governance isn't providing those to you, then you are handicapped. Your practices are going to be handicapped until we can get those things built in and put in place. And I'm going to talk about some practical things that you can do for that. Let's talk about business controls. This looks like a not good situation, but interestingly enough, if you talk about the technology, this isn't on my script, by the way, if you talk about the technology in that race car right there is a lot of business controls around that. That is not a race driver fighting for his or her life. That is a automobile that is operating within a risk-managed business control, and the onboard extinguishing and the safety features of that automobile that are already mitigating risk because they're built into the tools and the practices and the engineering of that automobile. It's a fascinating study in risk management or business controls because they're built into the system. It's not all up to the driver, get out, get out, get out, because that's very, very reactionary. But some of those things are instantiated in policy and processes. In other words, we simply say, we don't do this, we always do that, make sure you do this, and we expect people to comply with that. Those are relatively soft controls, and we put a lot of emphasis on those traditionally, but increasingly, we put business controls in automation. So if you have workflow automation, if you're in a CI/CD environment, or you have parts of your workflows or your value streams where we have automation, is we're actually building those business controls into the process. So as a real simple example is no changes get moved into production unless they've been tested to some standard. Well, in those kind of pipelines where you're actually automating it, it's the only way that that change can move past this checkpoint is if it passed the defined test and moves on. The only way it can be released to production is if an authorized approver clicks on the button and says, yep, we're releasing this into production. So business controls don't mean slow and bureaucratic. They just simply mean that those controls are built into the system, just like I was talking about with this race car here, is that we build that in because we need to control the environment so that we can go quickly. Let's talk about decision making. Now, this is I'll pause before I put up my next graphic. If you just take a brief look around here, look where everybody is looking. Everybody's eyes are on something very, very specific, and everybody has a very specific role. And so you can instantly see. Now, by the way, and I was going to show I was going to show that graphic that everybody shows, that overhead of the red Formula One car that comes in, puts on fuel, 4 tires, makes a wing adjustment, and is out of the pits in under 2 seconds. 2 seconds. That is an incredible amount of velocity. But one of the questions I always ask, because we're always amazed with that, because that is choreography of the top order. But my question is, why 2 seconds? Why not 0 seconds? And the answer is because some things have to happen. They need to happen. You won't finish the race if you don't have fuel. You won't be able to drive fast if your tires are worn out and you're unable to stick to the track. And it's the same in our organizations. We can build processes that go way, way too fast and overdrive our ability to control it, and then we crash or we have catastrophic. So in a situation where we're moving at this level of speed and precision, you can't just suddenly have that guy on the bottom left with the ratchet wrench there decide, I think I'm going to go over to the other side of the car and see if I can help that guy put on that tire. That's catastrophic. He'll probably get run over because he'll go in front of the car. And so we've got to ask ourselves, where is the decision-making authority within this? And all decision-making authority, or all authority, comes from the governing body. Now, governing body, that's a new term that I hadn't used earlier, but it starts with the most senior, typically board of directors, ultimately is the governing body within an organization. That can be delegated and moved to others. And where it is, it needs to be made very, very clear who is being given what level of decision-making authority and what are the bounds around how those decisions can be made and what are the limits of that. You can't decide anything, but you can decide certain things within your domain. Who gets to decide that? And those are things where this one thing alone, decision-making or clarity in decision-making, I believe, and that's based on years in service management, but especially years as a CIO, this is where a lot of delays and sluggish performance comes from, is we're not clear who can make decisions. And you guys all well know that, indecisive managers or managers that can't seem to make up their mind, or they'll sprout an opinion after the fact, but not before. That's problematic. And it's very true that that's problematic, because you won't move with as much speed and precision if you think that somebody might say, oh, you don't get to make that decision. Why did you decide that? And so if we want people to move with speed and precision, we absolutely have to be clear on what their level of decision-making authority is and stick to it, not be flapping in the breeze with, decisions. All right. Goal alignment. I love this picture here because if you look down at the telemetry unit on what we would think of as a steering wheel, this car is traveling at 186 mile an hour, and I believe 4 is in the 4th gear. So that is a tremendous amount of speed for you and me. I've never gone that fast. And the time-space continuum and the margin of error is incredibly high. And so we don't have time to discuss or debate or go out for coffee and think about some of those business fundamentals. It must be aligned that everybody involved has to have the same view. And one of the things we talk about in governance is the idea of a goals cascade. It's not unique to me. It's certainly, if you study COVID, that's part of the structure of the framework. But the idea is that every group aligns with the goals from above. And I know what you're thinking. I was like, oh my gosh, that could take a year. I mean, in my organization, we do an annual plan, and then everybody, by end of Q1, Q2, we have our goals that are in alignment with that. Meanwhile, the rest of us are doing the work, knowing that it's like, we can't wait for these goals to cascade. And so there's been a tremendous focus on, we've got to converge very, very quickly. If something changes at the top, it needs to propagate all the way down the chain incredibly quickly. So we need to rework some of our governing structures and our decision-making structures so that governance can be as agile as we need to be in a DevOps agile software delivery model. Governance, though, is responsible for making sure that the goals that are set at the top, and then management takes those all the way down the rest. And you see that demarcation again. I probably should have put a line in there. Governance makes sure that we're clear about those goals, and then management cascades them all the way down. And that those goals then are realized in an operational sense in the day-to-day practices, which is where we live. So without these chains in place, without the agility and the delivery in all of these elements that I've talked about, we are going to struggle. We're going to actually go much, much slower. And that's why I'm really focusing on this, because sitting in the CIO's chair, all of a sudden you realize, man, it's on me. I got to get this in place because I know what it's like to work on a process or a practice or trying to build a capability with an IT without those air cover, I like to call it, or without the right pieces of monitoring, evaluation, and direction coming from and going up to above. That's really becoming important. We're going to talk real quickly about value generation. I'm hoping we've got just about 15 minutes, and I'm hoping that you've put in questions because I'm dying to get to those. But value realization really is about, is everything that we're doing maximizing the value for this organization? And that borders on a philosophical question, but from a very practical standpoint is, if the activities that I'm following in a practice don't help us achieve maximum value for the organization, then chances are good that I'm doing something wrong. Now, there's a question that comes up immediately. It's like, well, value maximization might mean that we need to move faster, and things like our change management or our project governance or our project and portfolio processes, those things are really slow and they're very bureaucratic, right? Do they need to be, is my question. Not, do we need to get rid of them? We need to do them. But are they doing so to maximize value? And some of the coordination activities, and I talked about the pit stop, the 2-second pit stop, is if we really wanted to win races, boy, if we could figure out a way not to have to stop for 2 seconds, which includes the time of slowing down the 2 seconds and the time of speeding back up, that's a tremendous investment in gasoline and tires. But we won't make it if we don't. And so some things maximize value simply by making sure that we achieve the goal at the end of the day in a way that's consistent and compliant with expectations. So there's a balance there. It's not all about speed. It's about the balance of all of those items. And effectiveness is measured in value created. And those are really important things, because I see so many processes, especially, and even now that we're talking about practices, I see a lot of practices where we're still throwing process level metrics on it. And we need to understand that the reason that we've elevated to practices is because that ties with what your CIO and other senior managers need to align them with governance. You get their attention. As a CIO, despite spending years and years working on processes, I found myself really uninterested in the details of an incident or a change practice. I know that sounds terrible, but now I know why CIOs aren't interested, because they are focused primarily in the governing body that's driving down. And so the best thing that your CIO can do for you is translate that into meaningful measures, meaningful directives, so that you can make sure that your practices are operating at optimal efficiency and empower you to make those decisions. Don't expect them to do it. That's your job, but their job is to provide the right governing context in which you can do that. So I was going to be a little more dramatic, but out in the real world, this is what we normally deal with. This is reality for most of us, including me. Been there, done that. So how do we make it actually work in the real world? Well, vertical alignment is absolutely critical. We have to have vertically aligned, horizontally integrated value delivery streams within your organization. That is really key. So as you're building out your practices, recognize that there's a governing piece, whether it exists now or will someday in the future. It exists, or it needs to exist, and you need to build your practice so that when those things come online, we can start having those conversations. How does it work? Do not build a practice based on the idea that, well, nobody cares anyway, so we're going to do the best we can, and then resent when they come in and start saying, oh, well, we need to exert some control over this. And that happens in organizations all over the world. We as practitioners, we need to recognize that there is a vertical alignment, and that we want that, we need that. So agility and execution is important, and that means that the governance piece has to be as agile as you expect us to be in the delivery of value within our organization. And when I say agile, I don't mean software development, but that's part of it, because you think in agile DevOps value chains is we're delivering value in sometimes less than 24 hours. We're going from a backlog item to a delivered into production in a very, very short period of time. So how does governance move up to that level of speed and execution? That's a big challenge, and that's what we want our senior leadership to work on, is creating the right lines of communication coordination so that we can effectively evaluate, direct, and monitor all of those things without slowing them down and making them slow and bureaucratic. We got to have clarity in decision making. Now, if you're in the practitioner's role, these are conversations that you want to have early and often. And don't be afraid of having those conversations, because when that friction comes up, or when somebody says, who are you to make that decision? That's a good question. I welcome that question. And I answer that question. Well, I expected that because I was the process owner, or I was the service owner, or whatever, that this would be a decision that's made. You seem to feel otherwise. Let's talk about that. So getting into dialogue around decision making is extremely important. What isn't helpful is to argue about it. Well, who are you to step into my process? That's my process. That's unhelpful, and we do it a lot, by the way. We have to optimize for value realization. And what I'm talking about here is the demolition derby that's happening behind there, the reality where not everything happens like it does in the books, or when you hear the experts talk about this. It's like there's a reality, but we still have an obligation to do these things. So to the best of your ability, when you're building your practices, when you're operating within your practices, ask yourself, are we making the most value that we can for the organization in doing this? And you have to think about how you're interacting with other parts of the organization. You can't just put the blinders on and just do your thing and hope that other people are doing their thing. And you just recognize that your practices need to align with governance that may or may not exist, or may or may not be at a level of maturity that's as helpful as you would like it to be. So that's kind of that. Now let's get down to the practical, been there, done that. And then we'll lead right into questions. So get those keyed up, Lisa. So here's the thing. You guys got to operate in reality. I have to. I talk about this and I talk about the way we should be moving. And I try to do so in a way that's practical and approachable and helpful. But there is a reality that your organization is not like every other organization. There's similarities, of course, but you have to operate in the reality that you have, and you have to solve the problems that you actually have, not the ones that somebody else has, the Spotify model or, the unicorn folks that talk at the DevOps conference. If you have those problems, great, that's good guidance. But if you don't have those problems, you have to solve the ones that you actually do have. You have to think big, because eventually we're all going to get there. I hold out that hope in every organization I've ever operated in, but we have to operate in the small and move incrementally towards that big vision. So don't get frustrated that you're not operating at level 5 maturity or that you don't have the right kind of governance. Think about, like, what would it look like if I did, and then move in that direction incrementally and accept the maturity that's happening within your organization. You have to embrace governance. Do not allow yourself to resent governance or to denigrate governance to being something that they do to us or something that clueless people are just trying to make our jobs miserable. If you go there, you've lost your ability to truly, truly optimize and do great things within your organization. So embrace governance, but help it get better. Do your part to build from below a functional governance. Ask the questions. I need guidance here because I want to be able to move quickly. I need you to help us understand what the preference is. How would I know when you change priorities? How does that come all the way down to my organization? Those are the things that you can do to build functional governance. Work across organizational boundaries. I'm famous for walking into the areas of the building that I'm not supposed to be in because of my role. Why? Because if we're not operating as one organization, then we're not operating in a modern IT context. There is no hierarchy. There is no people that are more important than others. We're all part of a value chain, and we're all doing our part to deliver on that value proposition. And that's part of the culture of a high-performance organization. And the last thing that I want to leave you with, which is a bit of a personal encouragement, is don't stay frustrated within your organization. Every organization is struggling in some way in its maturity. Nothing is the way you would really want it. Nothing is ideal. There is no unicorn organization out there where you can go work for them, because as soon as you join them, you learn that they've got problems just like everybody else. So buckle down. Don't get frustrated. Ask yourself each and every day, how can I help guide this organization? And as a practitioner in the practices, aligning with governance is critically, critically important. And with that, Lisa, I'm going to go over to my question mark and see if we've got questions in the queue.
Indeed, we do. And
right.
also, may I say, I really enjoyed that. You're very passionate about this topic, and it was full of energy. I liked it very much.
Thank
So
you.
I actually have several really good questions, and we only have 4 minutes left until we get to the top of the hour. So at 12 o'clock, I'm going to sort of do the official close, but then we'll stay on for the rest of the questions. So if you guys can stay a little bit longer, please do. If not, it'll be part of the recording. So I think you did answer John's question, but I'm going to re-ask it just to get a very succinct response.
Okay.
And then you'll see what I mean when I ask it. And then I've got several other good ones for you. And this came off of the second polling question. So the business is accountable for IT governance, CEO, question mark. Like, in the end, if you had to pick for most organizations a one sentence, one word answer, where do you put it?
Board of directors.
Okay.
It is the board of directors. The challenge is, if they're not doing it, or if senior leadership isn't doing it, then that doesn't nullify the entire practice. The part of the problem that we face is we have people in that leadership chain who don't know what their true role is, and they're focusing on management when they should be focusing in on governance, and vice versa. That is the challenge that we face. And to that last point, you have to operate in the context that you have, but recognize that that's part of the challenge that we're facing.
And that rolls right into Satoshi's question, which is, how do you begin to do that shift to away from governing yourselves to understanding that it's really got to be at another level?
Yeah, because you can't tell somebody, hey, I can't do my job unless you do yours. That's usually not a good conversation.
No, that's not good.
I've tried it. It doesn't work. But I do encourage informal conversations, and never let a good disaster or whatever, a bad situation, never let that pass without raising some questions like, well, it would have been really helpful, as you can see, if we would have had guidance here, so we would have known what decisions we could make here and which ones we had to elevate. So how could we work on building a decision-making structure where we get what we need and we don't overstep our bounds? Those are kind of the conversations that get people's eyes open. Nobody responds well to, well, this is all your fault because you're not doing your job. And please don't quote me as saying that, because I'm not saying that. Because we all need to recognize that we have been operating in a model that may not be optimized for modern thinking.
So Mark's question is a good follow-up to that, which, and I can answer part of it for you, is Mark's got a group of service management professionals who believe that governance is process-based only. Can you suggest a way for me to help them understand the world doesn't revolve around them? And Mark, I would say have them listen to this webinar recording. And he also has a follow-on to that, so I'm going to throw both of them to you right now, which is his follow-on is, ITIL 4 touches on, but it really only scratches the surface of enterprise governance, in his opinion, which I agree with. Is COVID a good framework to look at, and do you have any suggestions?
Those are really good questions. I would love to connect with you to dialogue further, because I think you have some insight that would be helpful to others as well. But let's start with, it is very, very common for service management folks to believe the sun rises and sets around them, and I feel like I can say that because I've been doing this. I think I probably checked in around version 1 of ITIL, and I've been doing this for a long time.
Greg,
Yeah.
I am so sorry that those 4 minutes went quick. I just want to, for everyone who has to drop off, it is the top of the hour. Thank you all so much for joining us. We do these every month. We have the next month, we've got Blaine with BMC coming in to talk about their internal program and what they've done with service management. They've done some really cool stuff. Highly recommend that you join us. As you're exiting this webinar, it's going to ask for you to throw in topics and ideas. I really use those to pick our next webinar topics. So, any ideas that you guys have in there, please be sure to share with us. And that's all the housekeeping I'm going to do. I'm going to take it right back to you and let you finish your answer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that was a lot to cover, and we can possibly do some follow up. So it's very common for your service management folks to believe the sun rises and sets with them, and it's not because they're egotistical. It's simply because they are passionate about service management is the answer to all the world's ill. In a lot of cases, it actually truly is. But in other cases, we're actually enforcing and I've been one of them. We are enforcing some of the worst of the behaviors that we get accused of, and that is we create silos around processes. We create silos around the various teams. We pit folks against each other. Change management. I got a tiger by the tail because I started in the world of change management many, many moons ago, and everybody hates change management. Everybody hates the cab. Everybody hates the change manager, or they love them the day that they're trying to get their change through. And it's because we put these rigid practices in place, and we do them because we're passionate about having effective and efficient practices, and they're being consistently followed. And we recognize that others don't have the same passion for it, that if your auditors come in and find that you're not complying with your own internal policies, that you're not following your processes, that's a bad thing. That presents risk. So there's a lot of reasons that we do, but we need to stop being the uncle at the family reunion playing volleyball that's running all over the court, because that person there might drop the ball. So I'm not even going to give them the chance. I'm going to hit the ball. And this person over here, I don't think they can hit the ball. And there's that annoying person that's running all over the court, not letting anybody else do their job because they see and they have the importance about winning the game and making sure no balls get dropped. And sometimes we're that. And when we let other people understand how they interact with us and allow them to play their role, even at an immature and growing rate, we do the net result is much, much better. So what I would encourage is a gentle opening of the eyes. I would encourage, and I'm not the answer to everyone's problems, but I do recommend having a conversation around governance where we take the zoom lens back and say governance is a much, much broader kind of perspective. And governance, the very same governance that says that your incident management processes needs to be precise, documented, and well executed, and we need metrics that demonstrate that you're doing that, are the same ones that need to make sure that your supply chain is optimized to make sure that you don't run out of widgets to make widgets in an organization. It's the same governance. It's the same risk management. And so we need to recognize that we are part of a much broader value delivery system within the organization. It's not just about IT. So pulling people back and allowing them to see a bigger picture. The one that's most challenging with a lot of organizations is that it's not particularly helpful to say, well, if Susie's CIO would do her job better, it would be so much easier for us, but because she's not, we're left with this struggle. That's not going to fly. That's not going to help anybody, and we all know that. But the truth is, it actually would help us. So having those conversations, even with your own team of, if tomorrow we came in and this was a little bit better, what pieces would be there? And go to work on those pieces. How can we move incrementally towards, I think it would be better if we had, a daily stand-up, if we had different levels of communication and coordination around the various things. And that's what I tried to do as a CIO, is rather than come through and just go, holy cow, you guys, we got to get something going. I tried to zoom back and say, let's see where we can make some progress, harvest that energy, have somebody who says, this is really frustrating. I can't believe that these guys are doing this to us. And I ask them questions like, well, why do you think they do that? And what could we do about it? And the answer almost always comes down to, let's go talk with them. Let's have a conversation around them. I was the master of saying, hey, I think we have a disconnect here. So I'm going to write down what I think the answer is, and then I'm going to ask you to take a look at that. And those almost always started a conversation around, no, that is absolutely not what we do. And I say, okay, what do we do then? And then I write down what they say we do. And then we start a conversation around what we could do. And it's never the same as what I had or what they had. It's always a more optimized. And that's what I mean when I say, start working across those barriers. And that includes going to senior leadership and just saying, hey, help us to understand how we can align. But that nobody leading a webinar, despite what level of experience, is going to solve your challenges. These are just some of the things that I've done and that I see working in organizations. But we have to change at the cultural level. We've got to stop. One of the key criticisms of service management as a practice is we become little tyrants with our process because we're so passionate about it. And that's one of the reasons that we've earned a command and control reputation, is because we say, no, you must follow the change management process or the configuration management process. You must, and you're out of compliance, and you need to get your people. And somebody, if you've ever seen a policy that say, failure to comply with this, with bringing assets onto the network in the appropriate way may lead up to discipline, including termination. It's like, whoa, talk about heavy-handed. That, and we've earned that reputation. But if we talk in terms of business outcomes, a business outcome isn't to fire people who don't follow the process. The business outcome is to actually achieve those things, which might be compliance in asset management, asset inventory, financial controls around how we manage assets. And it might be that we move more quickly to our business. And are we measuring that? Or are we measuring process? So that's my random thoughts around that. But you've named a very large problem in the industry.
Wow. So I have several thoughts on that answer. First and foremost, that is, made me think of sort of minimum viable improvement, right? We talk about CSI all the time, but to just start with what's the one thing that tomorrow could make this a little bit better, it's a really smart way to structure those kinds of conversations. And, that, while some of that advice that was baked in there is very good for, for to improve lots of things, it really does kind of answers the question of, what's one way that you can put go in governance is, exactly what Greg said, where you write down the way that you think, the way that the view of how you understand what it is and the other person understands what it is. That's a great way to start the dialogue. And I can see that would work particularly well in the kinds of questions that we're getting around how do we get off of self-governing, you know? So thank you for that. Also, random side note a little bit, but Greg, so many great webinars. Thank you, thank you, thank yous, just so you know that. And Judy is asking a question that I love, which is, should we start with governance, begin where we are building out our value streams for practice process design, kind of like tests before developers write code?
Hmm. That's the question. Yeah, it's a really good one. Ideally, now when a speaker says ideally, that means your mileage may vary and you're probably not going to be able to do that. Ideally, everything is derived from governance, because otherwise, how would you know what you're trying to achieve? How would you know that you need to do this activity? Governance has to tell you that. But there is a set of what I would call common law governance practices, i.e., you come to work for this company because we deliver products, and so grab a rope and start pulling in the direction of delivering that product. So we can't wait for unicorns to arrive. That ain't going to happen. So we start building practices around what we think are good practices, or a good set of baseline parameters. And I've done for years. I've gone to, and I'm not recommending this, because your mileage may vary, but I've gone to, like, say, NIST 853 that has some really nice controls, and just said, well, if we were to adopt this as a framework, here's some things that we should do. And when we're building our practices, we should just make sure these elements are built into it. I've done the same with, and I didn't answer the other element of the earlier question about COBIT. I've also gone to, back in the COBIT 5 days, I've gone to the COBIT structure and pulled out the control objectives. They call them control objectives, and said, let's just make sure that, like incident management has an expectation around, a clear escalation path, clear time frames, et cetera. And so I build those into the practices that we start adopting, and just say, I don't necessarily tell people it's like we're adopting, NIST or COBIT or anything else. I just simply say that let's just make sure that these elements are being covered. And the reason I think that's important is because as you start having more and more strategic conversations, as you work your way there, it becomes a relief and not a surprise or an unwelcome advance when governance starts acting the way governance needs to act, and it starts actually connecting. So I like to think of it as, if I'm operating a piece of machinery or something, there's buttons and dials and levers and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, if those levers aren't connected to the practice area within my organization, then when somebody goes in the control room and starts pulling those levers, nothing happens. That's where we are absent of governance, and we don't build our practices around that. So build your practices with a good set of good off-the-shelf standardized approaches, but build it in such a way that when somebody wants to adjust that lever, your process responds, or your practice responds as it should. And governance then starts seeing that it's like, oh, this isn't that hard. This is not rocket science. I don't have to understand everything. I just have to provide you the input that I should be providing you, or that you would like me to provide you, and I see how those pieces work. So that's my recommendation. But starting incrementally, and I'm not just quoting ITIL 4, because many of us have been saying that exact same thing, for decades. It's like you got to start where you're at. That's, back in the good old days, sorry, Lisa, but back in the good old days, we'd all go off to ITIL training and we'd come back and it'd be like, yay, I'm going to solve all the world's problems. And then reality hits the next morning when you realize that, you're the only one that's passionate about it, and you're the only one that sees the big picture, and it gets frustrating. And so what we've told people for decades is go home and say, if there's one thing that you could do to make it better, to make it more like what we talked about and start moving in that direction, what would that be? And let's go after that. That's kind of the mindset that I would adopt in that case.
So yeah, I agree too. That's one of the one of the value assets that we add in all our classes is a thing that we call the personal action plan. And I'm sorry because I'm just not trying to be salesy, just going back to what Greg said. And the goal of that is your short-term goals and your longer-term goals, because it is, everyone in class is so excited and ready to go, but then when you get back to the real world, having some guidelines to take those minimal steps forward, because a lot of little steps get you pretty far down the road, right? So anyway, another great question for you. Can you please talk about the role of principles in governance and how to appropriately balance principles and rules or controls?
As in, yeah, but that's a really good one. I have less experience in the principles based, but it's a core element of the modern culture in organizations, i.e., teach people how to make decisions within the organization. So, we do it in ethics all the time, in conflicts of interest, or, supplier relationships, all these other things where it's like, there's not a black and white answer here, but, the old newspaper thing that we used to have in state government, or they still do, I'm no longer in state government, is, if what you're doing were on the front page of the local newspaper, would that be okay? Would you be comfortable with that? If not, then you're probably in the wrong place. That's a principle, right? And I can tell you that some people take that to the extreme and say, well, I will never do anything because I might show up in the paper and I might look bad. Or some people will say, yeah, I'm perfectly happy if everybody knows I did that because I think it's the right thing for us to do for our organization. So it's teaching you how to make decisions, but it's not calibrating you. And I think that modern boards of directors and CEOs very much like to provide, and I said CEO, and I'm not contradicting myself, is CEOs go to boards of directors and say, help me define what the culture elements are. And those are principles, of course, that we want to operate by. So you've seen, and I don't want to name them, and I don't want to get people all jacked up politically, but you've seen some major personality flaws or moral failures in senior leadership in organizations, and how damaging that can be to organization. So you have organizations like unicorn organizations, you'll know who I'm talking about, who say things like, don't be a jerk. That's our guideline here. Don't be a jerk. Don't treat people badly. Things like that. And they seem like they might be unhelpful, but on the other hand, it's like, would you want to be treated that way? When we're looking at behaviors, when it comes out how horribly you treat people when you're out in public and you're representing our company, it's like, is that the persona that we want to? And those are questions that you need to ask yourself. As I'm representing this company, does that make me look bad? Does that make my company look bad? Those are all principles that we try to implement. The problem with principles is they become a dialogue around, well, I think those are fine. My behavior is perfectly fine. Well, we don't, right? We don't think that was an acceptable behavior. Whereas hard controls, thou shalt test every release before it goes into production. That's not a principle. That's a hard rule that is often instantiated in the tool. So you can't get around it. So I believe that as the organization culture matures, you're going to see more principles and more people who are on board with, this is how we behave. We don't do, these other things. I think you see more of that. I think you talked about the balance between the two. And I think the balance is, right now, we're probably pegged out on the just do what you're told, and we're moving the needle more towards act in a way that's consistent with our corporate values. So a lot of the startups, a lot of the very irreverent startups that, 1 and 2 people in a basement that are doing right now, like literally this moment, they operate on principles. They get together because they're like-minded and they share certain values about what we want to do. We want to change the world. We want to, increase, social justice, or we fundamentally have some things upon which we agree, and then we go do some things that are in alignment with that. But what the struggle that those organizations have, and this has been true for hundreds of years, as those organizations mature and you hire lots and lots of employees, when you're successful, is you can't hand select everybody based on the do you believe what I believe. And so then you start talking about principles. We believe in treating people fair. We believe in but preferring a green supply chain. We prefer suppliers who have a social statement that we agree with, things like that. And so we shift from being principle based to having a more balance. Like some things are just hard rules. You just we can't have SOX requirements being flaunted. That's not okay. Those are hard rules. But in terms of decision making and values and ethical decisions, we move over to principles. So I've kind of walked around that. But what I see is a shift. And if you could see my hand signals, I'm pointing a needle that's going from the left and moving closer to the right. And where that is depends on how quickly the culture adjusts and what the organization's leadership, and I'm talking about governing bodies, have for appetite for risk around, are we okay with suddenly not having rules that say thou shalt? And are we okay with saying you should? Are we getting the results? What level of risk is that to the business? What level of risk is that to us doing an IPO, next quarter? It's just not a time to be moving over to principles. I mean, a lot of those things are very, very dynamic, and they are governed principles. They are things that only the governing body can decide on for the company. That's a really good question. I love that question.
It was a really good question. I meant to shoot just you a link, but I've sent it out to everyone. As Greg was saying that, the company philosophy, which was written the very first week 17 years ago, I was sharing that link to you, but everyone's got it. Feel free to go look at it if you would like to. So unless anyone else has a question, let me just make sure. Oh, yeah, it looks like we have covered them all. Excellent job, Greg. Awesome session. Excellent webinar. Thank you, ITSM Academy and Greg Sanker. You guys are welcome. So I'm going to stop the recording now. You're welcome, Nina. If I can figure out how. Nope. The tools made some updates, and it's we're just gonna officially say goodbye. Thank you all very much for joining us again. Blaine's gonna be talking about the internal ITSM program and the really cool stuff they've done at BMC, and that is next month is the 21st. Oh, it is the third Thursday. So October 21st at 11 a.m. You all will be getting an invite. We look forward to having you join us. Mr. Sanker, I cannot thank you enough. I really enjoyed today's session, and I shall talk to you soon, my friend.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.